To be here today. Thanks. And I also just appreciate it's no small thing to be here at 8 o'clock in the morning. And you might have some other things that are pulling you during this time, but just thank you so much for coming this morning and for me to be sharing, I think, something that's pretty near and dear to my heart. And so when Aaron asked me to talk, I was really excited to come share a little bit with you all. I want to talk a little bit about what brings me here because I think that's first and foremost what brings me to this work. So my background is as a middle school and high school teacher. I live in Southern Oregon. I My kids attend school here, and I think my biggest learning came from, my who and what brings me here, which is my son Noah, who is in the center. You might recognize some of these places, Mount Ashland in one side, and then the whole other side of the country, Florida. My husband's from Louisiana, so do we meet everybody together in Florida during Thanksgiving. I wish I could say that that's like representative of what our life looks like all the time. It looks like a lot of adventure. Just happened to find the pictures of us all together actually all looking pretty good. So what who brings me here really is my son Noah. At the age of 4, he was diagnosed with autism, and I had actually participated as a teacher in a lot of IEP meetings and really felt like I understood what it looked like to, support a child on an IEP or a child on a 504 as a teacher, and just realized in my role as a parent that it felt very different. So I've been really fortunate to be able to marry my understanding of schools and having been a teacher with also what it feels like to navigate um, supporting my son and also him accessing his education as a neurodivergent student. So, anyway, excited to share a little bit more about that. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Fact Oregon. So, every single state has what's called a Parent Training and Information Center. We're funded through the Office of Special Education, so federally funded, and then also through the Oregon Department of Education as well. And so we are a nonprofit, but we are have we did a proposal and have been the PTI now for gosh, I'm trying to remember, maybe 2012, since 2012 or 2013. And really, the cornerstone of the work we do is really about empowering families and youth with disabilities to pursue whole lives, um, and also to transform how people think about disability. Who do we serve? Well, there's no eligibility requirements, so anyone can call us. So I actually work with school teams all the time. I work with teachers all the time. I work with RAP teams. We work with legislators. We work with community partners. There's literally no eligibility requirement. So you don't have to be accessing any services or anything. People can just call and reach out to us, and we help get them connected or support them in whatever they're dealing with. We have a support line, which I really love. It's sort of like the cornerstone of the work we do as a support line, which means when people are calling us that they're with questions, we're connecting with them directly. It could be through Zoom, it could be through email, could be through text. It's whatever way works best for whoever is on the other end. We also offer trainings. We just did a full day summit on special education, and then we do, a transition to adulthood summit. We do different trainings throughout the year. We have a transition to kindergarten actually coming up on April 4th as well. We do outreach. So we do like, social media, things like that. I'm really excited to share that this is going to be our 5th cohort of Activate Your Advocacy, which is a parent leadership training for families. Our 5th one will be this spring. We're in the process of reading applications now. We have 140 applications for 25 slots for a parent leadership training. And it's all about how to get involved, be engaged, understand, and participate in your school communities. So we're really excited about that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, you already received some of the objectives for the day: understanding neurodiversity, combating bias and ableism, and reflection and practical application. And what I really like to think about is, um, how do how do you take whatever the nugget is today, right? Whatever that is that you think to yourself, ooh, either it's like, that is brand new understanding for me, right? That's something new that is a piece of information that I'm going to take out. Maybe it was a reaffirmation of what you already know, right? Or a reminder of, yes, okay, that was a good reminder. Or it could be that, like, pat on the back, because literally this is part of the process of what we're doing as we are supporting kids, right? So just thinking about what is it that maybe is your takeaway at the end of this time that you can take and put into like a practical application um, within your school setting to support all kids. I always like to start by sort of setting some grounding or a yes statement at the very beginning. So just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page around, what we are thinking or what we are believing. And so, yes statements for me are really important. So this is the yes statement that I created for today, which is: we believe and are committed to creating an inclusive and supportive learning environment for all students. Okay. I would imagine, as I am saying that, that we are all are feeling like, yes, I mean, that is what we feel called to do. We feel called to make sure that all students are welcomed, that they are included, that they're supported in a learning environment. And so I want to layer that on with one additional. You'll notice there's like a little blank space there. I want to layer this additionally into the yes statement, which is: we believe in the value of neurodiversity and are committed to creating an inclusive and supporting learning environment for all students. Right? So when we're thinking about, and I just want to call this out. The reality is that families and students might be navigating multiple complicated systems, of which schools are one of those systems that can be really complicated and can be feel even more complicated when a student is neurodivergent. So I want to think about, if that's our yes statement today, and as we're thinking about what it looks like in order to create welcoming and inclusive, supporting and learning environments for all students, we really mean all students when we're talking about that. And so that's really what we'll be diving into today. Some of the information that I'm sharing with you, you might be like, yeah, I totally already know that. And so for those of you who are already familiar with some of these terms, thank you for an opportunity to just reflect a little bit more on what those mean. I really like this definition personally, and the term neurodiversity has some history in around the 1990s, as people were beginning to think about, how might we look at or think about or talk about people's brains who work differently, right? And so this is a definition that I really like about neurodiversity: the concept that there's a variety of ways that people's brains process information, function, and present behaviorally, rather than thinking there is something wrong or problematic. When some people don't operate similarly to others, neurodiversity embraces all differences. So I really like that as a definition for us for neurodiversity, and you can find other definitions as well. But what I'd like for you to do today is kind of hold in your mind, maybe a student that you've worked with, right? Maybe a child that you've met, right? That would fit into the category of being neurodiverse, right? So try to hold somebody in mind that maybe is somebody whose brain maybe processes information differently. Okay. And it might be that you are holding in your mind a student that maybe it's been difficult to figure out how do we best provide support, right? How do we include and welcome, right? As we're thinking about this, because, if what we're looking for is people to behave in the way that we expect them to behave, and then they are behaving differently than that, that can be difficult, right? To figure out how do we provide that support. That's when when I'm talking with families a lot of times, I actually have a like a little like magnifying glass and like I'll pull it out sometimes and say, "Remember, behavior is communication. You might be expecting this, right? This is what you expect the behaviors look like, but it's something else." And so, how do we like use our magnifying glass? How do we really look closely like a detective to try to figure out what's going on? Okay. So when we're talking about neurodivergent, okay, neurodivergence refers to any structured, consistent way that brains work differently for a group of people than they do for the majority of others. And so when you're thinking about neurodivergence, who are we talking about? So we might be talking about students, who are on the autism spectrum, ADHD, dyslexia. Hey, great little like information for you to also know about staff and the people that you're engaging with. Actually, teams function better when you have a member of your team that's neurodivergent. Okay. So good news to know is that there actually is research that supports like the benefit of collaboration and problem solving, working together as a team when you have people that would have autism or ADHD, dyslexia, any of the other sort of types of neurodivergence examples that I have included on here. So with keeping that in mind, and I just have to put in a plug for this for myself too. Part of what was really powerful for me to understand as a parent is that the purpose of education is to prepare a child for life beyond school. So as we're thinking about students who might not, fit into what we think how students learn, that the reality is that we're supporting them, right? We're teaching them in order to support life beyond school, and life beyond school um, includes all different type of people working together part in community. And so remembering that as we're thinking about how we might be providing support to all. So I'm going to stop for a second and I'm just going to put this question on here and give you an opportunity. Go ahead and unmute. So if we are saying that we are wanting to provide inclusive and welcoming schools for all students, and recognizing the value of neurodiversity, what might get in the way from that yes statement happening? What one of them being, what is my personal experience, right? What is my personal experience with um uh neurodivergence, right? What is my personal experience with working with or supporting or my own experience as the cornerstone of where we always start? So, one of the things I do want to talk about is I want to talk about bias. And I really want to call out the fact that we all, right, have our own bias. Um, Even as we were talking as a team, as we were going through our AYA applications, we as a work team, we were like, okay, we need to do some work in recognizing our own bias that we are bringing as we are even reading through these applications. It's not a matter of um, whether or not there you have bias. The reality is we all do, right? Based on our experiences or whatever. So I did put just the definition in here, but I don't want to spend too much time on that because I feel like you probably already know that, right? Prejudice in favor or against one thing. It could be a person or a group. And so I want to talk a little bit because I really like this quote, which is human beings are consistently, routinely, and profoundly biased. We are. The first place is to acknowledge that that is true, right? Um, we not only are profoundly biased, but we also almost never know that we are being biased. That actually kind of chills me a little bit to my core. And when we recognize and acknowledge that we are, and so how many of you have taken, like, there's like tests that you can take. We actually did it as an organization where everyone took tests that then showed our bias. And it was really eye opening, honestly. But it was the first step, and then acknowledging and then being aware of it. And so, what are some of the types of bias? We have conscious bias or explicit bias, or we have unconscious. So, I just want to talk a little bit about this one. So, conscious bias is that you are aware of it. It's easily observed, right? We know that we are being biased and we're doing it intentionally. Okay. Versus unconscious bias, which is it operates outside of our awareness and maybe can't be as easily observed. Okay. So, as we are thinking about our own bias, right? If you have a student in mind that you're thinking of, right? And I would encourage you to like think about when I think about our school system and I'm thinking about how we are educating kids, do I have some bias that exists around what students can do, what they can't do, where they can learn, where they can't learn? Um, just to give you like a really tiny snippet, I can remember that that my son was, we were going to go to a school and they said, oh, autism. Gosh, our campus isn't set up for runners. And I was like, guess what? He doesn't run. So there was automatically like assumption, or there was some sort of bias, right? That existed around autism that, oh, if you have autism, and that was like, that was like sort of an everyday thing, right? That was something that people had this understanding that based on a label that every kid who had autism was going to do this, right? Or that it looked consistent around, and there were, and I'm sure all of you know this, like, and can share this, but like, if you've met one kid who's autistic, you've met one kid who's autistic, like, right? You could say that about anything, any of ADHD, anything. But sometimes what we need to consider is that our awareness of our bias as a foundation, as we're thinking about systems, as we're thinking about how we are supporting and including students, we first have to start with ourselves, right? There is no neutrality, there's only greater or lesser awareness of your own bias. And it's only when we can identify our own bias that we then have the ability to think differently. I was sitting in Partners in Policy Making. I was a teacher at the time. Partners in Policy Making was for people who are disabled and parents of children who are disabled to learn and grow together. And they were talking about school systems. And this man, Michael Remus, who was well known in inclusive education, was talking. We were in a room full of people. And he said something about inclusion. And I said aloud, to everyone's gasp and horror, oh, you mean all kids? Like, it took me, I had gone through the majority of his presentation, and it wasn't until I recognized, uh, it was an awareness of my own bias in the moment. And I said it out loud, and I did get a lot of like, "What?" Right? But that was a huge pivot for me in recognizing my own bias within that situation. So I love this quote. There's only greater or lesser awareness of one's bias. Okay. Now, Alyssa, I feel like Alyssa was a plant because we cannot talk about um, neurodivergence. We can't talk about bias without talking about ableism. And I think actually we all kind of feel like, yeah, I know bias, right? But ableism for me feels like one that's a little bit more misunderstood. I really like Alice Wong. If you, I feel like as much as you can follow content from people that are disabled, I would encourage you to because it's my best learning. I'm a parent of a child. I'm not a disabled individual myself. And so my best information and learning actually comes from disabled individuals. Alice Wong is amazing, and she says ableism is entrenched in our culture, and it's not just about overt discrimination. It's the way we think, the way we design our world, and the way we make assumptions about what a normal life looks like. Normal in quotes, right? Okay. Another example of is Eli, who says, and this is the one that I really love. This picture is a picture somebody drew of Eli. Ableism flourishes in the assumption that disabled people are inferior to non-disabled people. These assumptions weave themselves into the fabric of our everyday lives. Okay. And so thinking about ableism within our school systems, right? Because they're fairly entrenched in the way our systems work. And it's compliance, it's attitudes, it's learning. All of the things are woven, how we design and create our spaces. It's woven within there. And at the heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed. There's two great models that I love. One is like the medical model, which is about fixing, and the social model that is about how do we come around and support an individual in order rather than fixing. How are we changing, creating, shaping our spaces to include all people? And the reality is that a lot of times we look to when we're thinking about how to create welcoming spaces, how to include all kids, we think towards if we can look at what that looks like for a student who maybe has the most complicated support needs, guess who that benefits? Everybody, right? Everybody benefits. And so how ableism can take many forms. This is like the easiest one for me. You maybe have seen this cartoon. So this is where I like to start, right? And could we please shovel the ramp? Right? Oh, okay, sorry. I thought somebody was so could we please shovel the ramp? And they're saying all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. But if you shovel the ramp, then we can all get in, right? So that's an easy one for us to wrap our brains around, right? Because it's space and how do we create space that is welcoming and inclusive and thinking about universal design and things like that. But it can take many forms, right? So lack of compliance with disability rights laws like ADA. I mean, we get calls all the time around ADA. I think there's a lack of understanding around it or refusing to provide those reasonable accommodations for ADA. Failing to incorporate accessibility into building design plans. Some of you all in your districts are doing some amazing things about creating sensory spaces, even within your general education classrooms, maybe spaces within your schools. So you're thinking about accessibility, you're thinking about incorporating, some design and learning spaces within your schools. This is not one that everybody's going to like, but I'm going to say it anyway. Segregating students with disabilities into separate classrooms or schools. Okay. The assumption that people, and I get continual placement options. We could talk about it, continue placement options forever. I'm happy to have more conversation about that. The assumption that people with disabilities want or need to be fixed, individuals being held to a higher standard than those who impose the standard or do not have a disability. When my child was in kindergarten, we were told in order for him to be able to be in the kindergarten class, which is a readiness model, that he would have to orient his body to the front of the room, have his feet planted on the ground, sit crisscross applesauce, and attend, look at the teacher when he was answering questions, and that he would not be in the class until he could demonstrate those things in a MAPS classroom. So guess who did not actually access a kindergarten general education classroom? My son didn't for many years. I'm happy to say he's 18 and he's about to graduate with a standard diploma. So huge shift, right? Huge shift during time. But that was me as a parent actively working with the school team in order to rethink or look at things differently. But thinking about holding kids to a higher standard. How many kindergartners are doing what he was told he had to do to earn his right to be in that room? So thinking about how we might be inadvertently creating ableist barriers within our schools is definitely something to think about. So I'm not going to go deep into this other than to say there is everyday ableism that occurs. There's overt and what we call subtle ableism that is happening all the time. So I don't have all the things on there, but thinking about the words that we're using as we're thinking about ableism. If we're saying words like, you can see the R word is over ableism, but saying words like lame, saying words like crazy, okay, language is really, really important. And so thinking about the words that we're using every day, that is ableist language, that is subtle and is woven throughout how we're talking, how we're engaging, how we're thinking about supporting all kids. I would say low expectations, right? Um, placing, like saying, oh, because this child has this, that, label, that they're not going to be able to do this or that or whatever. Also, anytime I have on here able savior complex, I also have like you're so inspirational. But any of you who have had an opportunity to listen to Stella Young, who's no longer with us anymore, who has an amazing TED talk that's called Inspirate. It's about inspiration porn, which on here we've said you're so inspirational because some people don't necessarily like that term, and it's obviously very shocking. But that's a great TED talk for you to kind of think about intrusive questions or not talking to a student, instead talking to maybe someone who's supporting the student instead. So just thinking about how you might explore those things that are below the surface, the iceberg, what we see on the top, and then what's below. What I will share with you is that the Oregon Department of Education, and I actually will share it as a resource, has a pretty good like guidance document around exploring ableism. This is one of the things that they utilize from it, but they have guiding questions that your school teams can ask around ableism within your school system. So I would highly recommend that as a document. And this is one of my very favorite ideas that I would like to introduce to you, which is presuming competence in the least dangerous assumption. How many of you have heard of the least dangerous assumption? If you could raise your hand. Or maybe it's a new concept. Oh, I'm glad if it's a new concept because it's a great one. So Anne Donnellan, she was the one that termed this presumed competence, coined, and she was a researcher. So the criterion of least dangerous assumption holds that in the absence of conclusive data, we love our data, educational decisions should be made on the assumption, which, if correct, will have the least dangerous effect on the likelihood that students will be able to function independently as adults. So let's look at what that is. Okay. This is what Donnellan says. Teachers should assume all students, regardless of intellectual ability, are competent and able to learn. Okay. I'm going to say that again because that sounds very simple, right? All students are competent and able to learn. That is what teachers should assume. Okay. And they should be provided every opportunity to learn. If they learn, great. That's wonderful, right? That's what we want, right? If they don't appear to learn after being presented with every opportunity to do so, then the consequences are not as dangerous as the alternative, right? What's the alternative? This child can't learn. We're not providing them the opportunities to meaningful, engaging opportunities to learn. Okay. So providing opportunities is far better than not. That seems really obvious. I think that seems really obvious. But my experience has been that we are not always presuming competence within our schools. Okay. So setting high expectations is far better than setting low expectations, right? Providing a rich, inclusive learning environment is better than accepting less and discovering when it's too late that the student had capabilities and potential that were missed. Okay. I'll give you a really, because I want to put a plug in for this, this young man that if you are Nico, his name is Nico Boscovich. Nico lives in Oregon. He has his own blog. He also is in Autism Spectrum magazine. He uses a letterboard to communicate. I happened to work with his mom years ago. But what I will tell you this is that Nico had always been in a self-contained classroom. He did not communicate verbally. He actually didn't have any communication device at all. And he was not accessing any academics. They just, and at one point mom pulled him out. Mom didn't think he was learning anything either. He ended up, somebody like worked with him around using a letterboard, of which now he uses more things besides a letterboard, and started using the letterboard. And mom had no idea. Loretta had no idea. And they blog about this. It wasn't until he was in middle school that they learned, because the minute that he started using letterboard, he actually could communicate in full sentences, had a lot to say. In fact, won an award to go travel, but then they found out he would need support and they pulled it away from him. He would be an amazing one to because it was that he did not have access forever. Then he ended up being diagnosed as twice exceptional. Once they realized that he had an opportunity to demonstrate that he understood. So the opposite can lead to adverse outcomes, right? For the student, such as fewer educational opportunities, inferior literacy instruction, fewer choices as an adult, right? That if we're not sort of setting that up ahead of time. So least dangerous assumption is one of my very favorite, and presuming competence, but also thinking about dignity of risk, which all comes in. So as you're thinking about that student in your mind, right? Are we supporting them in the right to take risks, right? Are we making assumptions around what they can or cannot do because what they're seeing looks different, right, than what we would expect behavior to look like, right? So are we making assumptions? Are we providing opportunities for self-determination? Are we providing, my experience has been that when my son was part of the conversation around support, right, that when he was the lead in that when we were saying, what do you need? I mean, I could say what I thought he needs forever. So could teachers. But the reality is when he said it, it was he knows what he needed in order for taking breaks, self-regulation, whatever it was, right? But when we included him in those conversations and gave him options, then what we thought was happening was actually not what was happening. But when we asked and we questioned and he was part of that process, we saw something completely different. So some of the things that I want to, in a moment, I know Erin is going to take you through some of the questions that I want you to think about. But I also wanted to share really quickly, and I might just skip to it really quickly, Erin, if that's okay, because I want you to have a takeaway for something to look at. So remember that I said if we look at providing support to students with the most significant support or cognitive disabilities, then we actually are creating more welcoming communities for all students. And so I do want to put a plug in for the TIE Center because one of the things that they really focus on is belonging and creating community. And they have really, really great resources for school teams to begin to think about how do we center belonging and community at the center of how we're creating our school, how we're creating our spaces. And then I also want to call out this is the document from ODE that's on understanding and addressing ableism in schools. How many of you, because there were some Swift schools down here at one point, but it lost some steam. How many of you are familiar with Swift Education Center? Okay, Swift Education Center actually has ways to look at transformation within your schools. So these are actually like documents for school teams and to look at how do we begin to think about promoting inclusive practices, including welcoming all students. Also, how many of you are familiar with inclusive schooling, Dr. Julie and Dr. Christie? Okay, so Washington State provides professional development for all of their teachers through Dr. Julie and Dr. Christie. And I got a chance to attend last summer. They're amazing. So that's another one that I would look towards. Probably most of you know Paula Kluth, who also is about inclusive education. And then I just wanted to put a plug in for the good work that I believe our state is doing for early childhood inclusion, also through the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center on how we can think about that transition from preschool childcare to kindergarten for students. And with that, I do want to say one more thing, which is some of you may be familiar with Jennifer Spencer Imes. She's with Westland Wilsonville School District, and they are a school that really did systemic change within their district, and their graduation outcomes have increased and all those things. But I was one of the things that Jennifer said in a meeting that I went to that I thought was really powerful is she said, we actually had to do this. The thought of like shifting all of the things that we were doing and like where do we even start to think about the system of education and how we might make change. She said we decided we had to shoot first, aim later, which I thought was really interesting. And she said we had to choose to do small things to move us in that direction rather than saying, oh, it has to be an overhaul, transformation, systemic. That's why I want you to think about yourself personally and the way you engage with the school. I want you to think about that student and how you might make some change or movement within your school team, within your classroom, whatever that looks like. Because what she said is one of the things that they did was if we had a student who only had a little bit of time in a general education classroom, we actually put them on the roster. And I get that it's complicated with scheduling and all the things. We put them on the roster rather than being a visitor in that classroom. We actually put them on the roster of the general education teacher so that they they saw a shift in ownership on how they would support the student. So even though they weren't in there all the time, they actually put them on the roster in order for, and she said that's one example of how we said, like, shoot first, aim later. If we were so hung up in all of the things and moving forward, then we were never going to move forward. But if we implemented things, changes within our school system, that would make, that they saw that's where the movement began to happen. So Erin, I'll let you, if you wanted to.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, and I'm gonna pause it for a moment.